She showed up at my door with fabricated police reports 8 months after I buried my husband. I was still learning how to make coffee for one person, still reaching for Robert's mug by instinct every morning before catching myself, still tending his rose garden because the alternative was letting something he loved die, and I wasn't ready for that. Sandra Whitmore stood on my porch in a blazer that cost more than my first month's salary and told me my behavior had been threatening community members and that formal complaints had been filed with the county sheriff. I asked her which complaints specifically. She smiled the way people do when they think their paperwork is more powerful than your reality. I closed the door and pulled her HOA registration documents. My name is Eleanor Marsh, 61 years old, retired federal judge. 30 years on the bench handling fraud, financial crimes, and every variation of legal manipulation human creativity could produce. Robert and I moved to Cedar Lake Estates after I retired because he wanted a garden and I wanted quiet water, and neither of us wanted to spend our remaining years in a courthouse. He got 8 months of his garden before the heart attack took him. Sandra Whitmore had been HOA president for 6 years. Silver Mercedes, former mortgage broker. Her husband Richard ran a real estate development company that had appeared before my court 3 separate times for fraud-related charges. I had ruled against him twice. The third case was still under federal review when I retired. She had no idea who had moved in down the street. The fabricated complaints alleged I had been harassing neighbors, allowing my property to fall into disrepair, and operating an unlicensed business from my home. The unlicensed business was a retired judge, occasionally consulting by phone with former colleagues. The property disrepair was Robert's rose garden going slightly wild, the way living things do when they are grieving alongside you. I spent 3 days pulling public records the way I had spent 30 years reviewing evidence. Sandra's HOA had collected $212,000 in special assessments over 4 years for lake maintenance projects. I requested the project completion records. 3 projects had been approved and funded. None had been completed. The contractors were all companies registered to Sandra's brother-in-law. The fabricated police complaints were designed to establish a pattern of behavior that could be used to pressure a sale. I had seen this exact scheme from the bench 4 times. I called a former colleague at the FBI field office, not to report Sandra, to ask a question about whether an investigation was already open. It was. Had been for 8 months. They were waiting for documentation that established the full pattern. I spent 2 weeks providing it. Sandra escalated while I worked quietly. Anonymous letters to my neighbors suggesting I was mentally unstable following my husband's death. A formal request to the county to inspect my property for code violations. A social media campaign using a fake account that posted photographs of Robert's rose garden with captions about neighborhood blight. She photographed my husband's roses and called them a blight. At the HOA meeting, Sandra called to address ongoing concerns about certain residents failing to meet community standards. She had prepared a full presentation. Charts, photographs, neighbor testimonials she had coached personally. I let her finish. Then I walked to the front of the room and introduced myself properly for the first time since moving to Cedar Lake Estates. Federal judge, 30 years, financial crimes specialist. And I laid Sandra's 4 years of financial records on the table beside the FBI case file reference number and the names of 3 neighbors who had already provided federal statements. Sandra looked at me with the first genuine uncertainty I had seen on her face. "Richard," I said quietly, "tell your wife who I am." Richard Whitmore had gone completely white. Federal agents entered through the side door. Sandra received 3 years for wire fraud and theft. Richard's pending federal case was reopened with the new evidence and resulted in additional charges. $212,000 returned to Cedar Lake residents. Robert's roses are blooming this spring exactly the way they always did when he tended them. I tend them now. Not as well as he did, but carefully. The way things worth keeping deserve to be cared for. He would have found Sandra Whitmore darkly amusing. He always said the most dangerous person in any room was the one who had nothing left to prove. He was right about that. He was right about most things.